With permission, I will make a statement about the United Kingdom's response to the situation in Ukraine. This winter, we've witnessed a spectacle that we hope to be banished from our continent. A large and powerful country massing troops and tanks on the border of a neighbour with the obvious threat of invading. Russia has, of course, already attacked Ukraine, illegally annexing 10,000 square miles of her territory in 2014, igniting a war in the Donbass region, and Ukraine has scarcely known a day of peace ever since. Now Ukraine faces the danger of a renewed invasion, and this time the force arrayed on Ukraine's frontier comprises over 100,000 troops, far bigger than anything Russia has deployed against her before. If the worst happens and the destructive firepower of the Russian army were to engulf Ukraine's towns and cities, I shudder to contemplate the tragedy that would ensue. Ukrainians have every moral and legal right to defend their country, and I believe their resistance would be dogged and tenacious, and the bloodshed comparable to the first war in Chechnya or Bosnia, Mr. Speaker, or any other conflict that Europe has endured since 1945. No one would gain from such a catastrophe. Russia would create a wasteland in a country which, as she continuously reminds us, is composed of fellow Slavs, and Russia would never be able to call it peace. For months, Britain has worked in lockstep with the United States and our allies across Europe to avoid such a disaster. We've sought to combine dialogue with deterrence, emphasizing how a united Western alliance would exact a forbidding price for any Russian incursion into Ukraine, including by imposing heavy economic sanctions. And at the same time, we stand ready, as we always have, to address any legitimate Russian concerns through honest diplomacy. On the 13th of December, I spoke to President Putin, and I stressed that NATO had no thought of encircling or otherwise threatening his country, and that Russia enjoyed as much right as any other state to live in peace and security. But as I said to him, Ukraine also enjoys an equal and symmetrical right to that of Russia. And I said that any attack on his neighbour would be followed by tougher sanctions against Russia, further steps to help Ukraine defend herself, and by an increased NATO presence to protect our allies on NATO's eastern flank. The truth is that Russia's goal is to keep NATO forces away from her borders. If that is Russia's goal, then invading Ukraine could scarcely be more counterproductive. My right honourable friends, the Foreign and Defence Secretaries, have both conveyed the same message to President Putin, and I'm prepared, of course, ready to speak to him again. Meanwhile, the American Deputy Secretary of State met her Russian counterpart in Geneva on the 10th of January, and the NATO-Russia Council gathered 2 days later, as the House knows. The American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, met the Russian Foreign Minister last Friday, and the US administration has confirmed President Biden's willingness to have another meeting with President Putin, continuing the bilateral dialogue they began last year. But credible deterrence is the other side of the coin. Last night, I held a virtual meeting with President Biden, President Macron, Chancellor Scholz, President Duda, Prime Minister Draghi, General Secretary Stoltenberg, President Michel, and President von der Leyen. We agreed that we would respond in unison to any Russian attack on Ukraine, in unison, by imposing coordinated and severe economic sanctions, heavier than anything we have done before against Russia. And we agreed on the necessity of finalising these measures as swiftly as possible in order to maximise their deterrent effect. We in the UK will not hesitate to toughen our national sanctions against Russia in response to whatever President Putin may do, and the House will soon hear more on this from my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary. We've already declassified compelling intelligence exposing Russian intent to install a puppet regime in Ukraine, And we will continue to disclose any Russian use of cyber attacks, false flag operations, or disinformation. Amid all these pressures, Ukraine asks for nothing except to be allowed to live in peace and to seek her own alliances, as every sovereign country has a right to do. Last week, the UK acted to strengthen Ukraine's ability to defend her soil by supplying anti-armor missiles and deploying a small training team of British personnel, in addition to the work of Operation Orbital, which, as the House will know, has trained 21,000 Ukrainian troops since 2015. Yesterday, we took the responsible precaution of temporarily withdrawing some staff and dependents from the British Embassy in Kiev, though I emphasise that the embassy remains open and will continue to provide consular assistance for British nationals in Ukraine. And I'm particularly grateful for the dedication of our ambassador in Kiev, Melinda Simmons. I commend our NATO allies for the steps they've taken and undertaking to protect the eastern flank of the alliance. Denmark is sending a frigate to the Baltic and deploying 4 F-16s to Lithuania to join NATO's long-standing air policing mission. France has expressed its readiness to send troops to Romania under NATO command. And the United States has raised the alert level of 8,500 combat troops, preparing to deploy them in Europe at short notice. The British Army leads the NATO battle group in Estonia, and if Russia invades Ukraine, we would look to contribute to any new NATO deployments to protect our allies in Europe. In every contact with Russia, the UK and our allies have stressed our unity and our adherence to vital points of principle. We cannot bargain away the vision of a Europe whole and free that emerged in those amazing years from 1989 to 1991, healing the division of our continent by the Iron Curtain. We will not reopen that divide by agreeing to overturn the European security order because Russia has placed a gun to Ukraine's head. Nor can we accept the doctrine implicit in Russian proposals that all states are sovereign, but some are more sovereign than others. The draft treaty published by Russia in December would divide our continent once again between free nations and countries whose foreign and defense policies are explicitly constrained by the Kremlin in ways that Russia would never accept for herself. More than half of Europe, including a dozen or more members of NATO and of the European Union, would be only partially sovereign and required to seek the Kremlin's approval before inviting any military personnel from NATO countries onto their soil. The Czech Republic, at the very heart of Europe, hundreds of miles from Russia, would have to ask the Kremlin for permission if she wanted to invite a company of German infantry to join an exercise or even to help with flood defenses. There is nothing new about large and powerful nations using the threat of brute force to terrify reasonable people into giving way to otherwise completely unacceptable demands. But if President Putin were to choose the path of bloodshed and destruction, he must realize that it would be both tragic and futile. And nor should we allow him to believe that he could easily take some smaller portion of Ukraine to salami slice because the resistance will be ferocious. Anyone who has been to Kiev, as I have, and stood by the Wall of Remembrance, studied the portraits of nearly 4,500 Ukrainians who've died in defense of their country since 2014. The total death toll stands in excess of 14,000. Anyone who's been there will know that the Ukrainians are determined to fight and have become steadily more skilled at guerrilla warfare. And if Russia pursues this path, many Russian mothers' sons will not be coming home. And the response in the international community would be the same, and the pain that will be inflicted on the Russian economy will be the same. When I spoke to President Putin, I also reminded him that at crucial moments in history, Britain and Russia have stood together. The only reason why both our countries are permanent members of the UN Security Council is because of the heroism of Soviet soldiers in the struggle against fascism, side by side with ourselves. I believe that all of Russia's fears could yet be allayed, and we could find a path to mutual security through patient and principled diplomacy, provided that President Putin avoids the trap of starting a terrible war. And, Mr. Speaker, a war that I believe would earn and would deserve the condemnation of history, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. And I'm grateful to the Defence Secretary for keeping the opposition informed of developments throughout the crisis. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Britain, Russia and the United States made a solemn agreement with Ukraine. In exchange for giving up nuclear powers and weapons, Ukraine's security was to be guaranteed and its independence would be respected. Ukraine has kept its end of the deal. President Putin has not. His Russia has annexed Crimea, supported separatist conflict in Donbass, and now massed over 100,000 troops on Ukraine's borders. These are repeated and unjustifiable acts of aggression. So Labour stands resolute in our support of Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. And that was made clear when our Shadow Foreign Secretary and Shadow Defence Secretary visited Kiev a fortnight ago, and I made it clear to the Ukrainian ambassador when I met him last week. This isn't just a local dispute on the other side of the continent. It's an attempt by President Putin to turn back the clock, to re-establish Russian force as a means of dominance over parts of Eastern Europe. And it's a direct threat to the anti-imperialist principle that sovereign nations are free to choose their own allies and choose their own way of life. That is why it is crucial that we in this House are united in opposing Russian aggression. So let me be clear. The Labour Party supports the steps that the government has taken to bolster Ukraine's ability to defend itself. We support international efforts to deter Russia from further aggression and the vital diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that during talks, the UK and our partners will be resolute in our defence of Ukraine's sovereignty and the security of our NATO allies? For too long, the implicit message to Moscow has been that President Putin can do what he likes and the West will do little to respond. We must now change course and show Russia that any further aggression will result in severe real-world consequences. For Britain and our allies, that will mean taking tough decisions. That won't be easy. Widespread and hard-hitting sanctions must include cutting Russia's access to the international financial system. Europe's over-reliance on Russian energy supplies is well documented, and it simply must be addressed. And in Britain, we have failed to rid our economic and political systems of the ill-gotten money used to support the Putin regime. If we take our obligations to global security seriously, we cannot go on allowing ourselves to be the world's laundromat for illicit finance. Labour has a 4-point plan. Really? First, reform Companies House to crack down on shell companies. Second, a register of overseas entities to lift the veil on who owns property and assets in the UK. Thirdly, tougher regulation on political donations. And finally, implement the recommendations of the cross-party Russia support to bolster national security. So I ask, will the Prime Minister support these measures to rid the UK of the loot of the corrupt Russian elite? We cannot stand up to Russian aggression abroad while facilitating Russian corruption at home. After the chemical attacks in Salisbury, after the annexation of Crimea, and now the threat of invasion in Ukraine. It's time to send a simple, clear and united message. We support Ukraine's sovereign right to choose her own destiny. We will stand with the Ukrainian people in the face of President Putin's threats. His aggression will come at a high price for himself and his regime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.